friends and educators. We are Lauren and Anne. Today, we're thrilled to welcome Dr. Denise Handlarski, a dynamic educator, researcher, and leader at Trent University's School of Education. Denise teaches courses in history and social justice education, with a particular focus on gender studies and anti-racist education for both the Bachelor of Education and the Master of Education programs. She also leads the School of Education's Well-Being program and coordinates the Sex Education Alternative Settings placement. Outside of academia, Denise is both a rabbi and a labor birth doula, and thus brings unique perspectives on the intersections of education, spirituality, and care. Denise believes we're living in a pivotal moment where institutions like schools have the opportunity to become more creative, dynamic, and aligned with the values of those they serve. In her words, we are at once overburdened and disconnected, too busy to do more, yet hungry for more that matters. Today, we're excited to hear her insights on wellness in education, as well as any tips that she may have about how we can all integrate wellness into our own teaching and learning. Welcome, Dr. Handlarski.
Thank
That's
you.
quite a bio.
Well, it's lovely to be here.
So today we're focusing on wellness in education, but perhaps let's start with learning more about you. Could you share a bit about yourself and what led you to pursue a career in academia?
For sure. So I started out trying to become a high school teacher, and I was a high school teacher. I also fell in love with academic work. So I remember this time kind of early on where I was really trying to decide between, I had my acceptance to a master's program and I had my first job offer as a full-time teacher with the school board at the same time. And I was really sort of figuring out these two pathways and what I was going to do. I ultimately decided to try to stick with both. So I taught part-time. I did a lot of substitute teaching. I did a lot of long-term occasionals, trying to stay in the schools while I was pursuing my graduate research, and ultimately became a teacher educator, which has been truly a dream come true for me.
Thanks, Denise. What was your area of study for your master's and then your PhD? I'm just curious.
I took a weird route. So a lot of people who work at a faculty or school of education have a PhD in education. My PhD is actually in literature. So I was working as a teacher, but I was doing graduate work in English and gender studies. And my PhD is in English with a focus on post-colonial studies. My dissertation was about South African literature. And I have always integrated a lot of anti-racist theory or post-colonial theory along with gender theory into my work. So it's atypical for somebody with my academic background to end up in education, but I always was an educator at heart. So I was doing work around, supporting TAs and professors in their teaching at the post-secondary level. I was also integrating different aspects. So part of my dissertation on South Africa involved looking at the school system. I went to South Africa to look at how they integrated the schools after the democratic elections in South Africa after the fall of apartheid. So I've always held these disparate interests and found ways to bring them together in my work. And I think that has served me well in my career, but also I think that's kind of where we're at as educators right now, trying to look at the world in a holistic way, be less siloed in terms of our subject area, and really thinking about the people we serve, our students, the people we work with, and what's going on in our multifaceted world and lives, and how we can bring it all together to make school a place where our whole selves can show up and be seen and supported.
Yeah, that's a fantastic quote. I love what you're saying about being less siloed, being integrated. For me, when I hear your bio, it really speaks to passion that you have. I mean, there's things in there that we could talk about all day, I'm sure, that you have so many passions. And I know that for me, I come from a music performance background and comes from a science background. That content knowledge that you have passion for me anyway, really drives the practice. And it connects to wellness because that's like the gas that fuels the machine, so to speak.
It not only connects to wellness, in a way it is wellness. So I remember when I was doing my Bachelor of Education, It feels like 500 years ago. And people were saying, well, there aren't a lot of jobs for English teachers right now. Maybe you should consider getting a math teachable or a science teachable. And I was like, well, I mean, obviously it would be wonderful if you're interested in math or science, but those weren't my interests. And I was like, do I really want to get a job and then spend my career doing something that I don't really like? And that was the kind of sensible advice that people were giving me. But I've always believed, and listen, one never knows if one's success is because of or in spite of the choices that they have made. I think though this world involves a lot of luck, as well as hard work. But I have found that following your passions and doing what you care about is always going to produce better work. And I think that part of how I ended up here is because I have always followed my heart and brought that heart to my work. It doesn't mean it's always been easy, lots of challenges along the way, but I think it is important. And all of the research on well-being, so often it comes from the field of positive psychology, which we can chat about. I started looking at positive psychology actually as part of my rabbinic education. And so the word that folks like Dr. Martin Seligman will use is flourishing. None of us will be happy all the time, but we can build lives of flourishing. And the most important ingredients for flourishing are human relationships and building lives of meaning and purpose. That's what leads to a good life. And so I think following your passion and doing work that you find meaningful, it like I said, it's not just connected to well-being, it's the building blocks for feeling well.
Yeah, I love that. And I really love what you say about, being true to yourself and living in that way. And I think as an educator too, I think that becomes obvious to the students we work with and can almost be a form or serve their wellness as well. Like I think passion is contagious. And we get to see other people being passionate about what they do and living as their authentic selves in that way, I think it's inspiring and it helps us too as a motivator as well. It's great.
Yeah, and we wanted to take a moment to just talk about what wellness is to you, although I feel like perhaps you've answered that a little bit with positive psychology and the idea about flourishing. But in this moment in 2025, it seems to me that wellness has become a bit of a buzzword. You hear it in many different contexts, both as a positive and as a pejorative occasionally. It's multifaceted. It means different things to different people. In some contexts, it carries political implications, which I think is surprising, but perhaps I should not be surprised. So what does wellness mean to you? And what sparked your particular interest in it? And I realize maybe you answered that a little bit already, but if there's anything else you'd like to add there.
Yeah, no, there's lots to say. So I do worry about being a part of a system where programming for wellness or well-being has been a band-aid for or a replacement for, supporting our institutions and structures. So in terms of education, it's very frustrating to teachers, and I agree with them when they have underfunded schools, a lack of support for their students, students who are struggling in myriad ways, and the teacher is trying to serve and support so many people, and themselves, they're unsupported, and then someone tells them to breathe. Like, this is not helpful, and well-being programming is never going to be a replacement for adequate funding and structural supports for teachers. And this is the situation we're working in, and teachers aren't well, and we're looking for ways to try to survive in the system. So I feel like this is where we're at. It is actually highly political, I would say. The other thing that makes it political and problematic is when people think of well-being as really kind of enmeshed with diet culture. So a lot of corporate environments, for example, have, quote, well-being programming that's really designed to get people to, have less body fat. And that's not well-being to me. So our approach is really, really different to that. We want well-being to be holistic. So at Trent, the way our well-being program started is because I applied to be part of a program called Teachers of Tomorrow, which was connected to the Workland School of Education in Alberta. And they were doing some innovative work on well-being for their teacher candidates and trying to broaden their scope. So they invited 5 sites to become pilot projects for their well-being programming. And I applied for our Trent School of Education to be one of them. And that's how it started. So through that, I got training and, different well-being programming opportunities. But every site could also create their own objectives and program parameters. So at Trent, in conversation with faculty and students, we decided to have our program goals be focused on a holistic sense of health. So that included physical well-being, emotional well-being, mental well-being, and spiritual well-being, which I'm happy to talk more about. And also health and well-being is connected to the environment and Indigenous connections. So we really wanted to take what is generally our programmatic goals and vision at the School of Education, which is about eco-social justice and Indigenous infusion, and bring it into the well-being program, because truly well-being is all of these things. What's good for us as humans is good for the planet. What's good for the planet is good for us as humans. And learning from the Indigenous people who have been caretakers of the earth, and also really focused on so much that's built into the many different Indigenous cultures has to do with well-being, community relationships, ritual, connection to the land. Those are aspects of well-being we also wanted to be featured in the program.
So how does that look? I know, I work at Trent, so I'm familiar. For our listeners,
right.
How does that look for a typical TC? How do they move through the well-being program? And thanks for that background, by the way. I wasn't aware of that. It's quite interesting. And thank you for taking that initiative.
Oh, it's a pleasure. It's been a labor of love. So the program has been through some changes. It launched late in 2019. And then you might remember early in 2020, the world changed. So fairly quickly, the well-being program actually became a way for people to be connected online during the COVID-19 lockdowns. That was not its original purpose, but that's what people needed in terms of their well-being. And then when lockdowns were lifted and we came back together, we continually are asking, what do people need now? So the basic building blocks of the program we have through our learning management system. Trent uses Blackboard, but it could be any learning management system. We have a group for people in the well-being program. And in that group, I've tried to create a structure that will encourage what in the well-being world people call habit stacking. So I've provided free links, because obviously budget is a concern for our students and for many folks. And so I have free links on there for yoga, for meditation, for journal prompts, ideas for ways you can move your body, again, not connected to diet culture, but just integrating some movement. So like dance videos, all different kinds of stuff. And then I ask the teacher candidates who are part of the program to commit to a practice to try on for a month. And it can be as little as 5 minutes a day, 5 minutes of writing down some things you're grateful for, 5 minutes of journaling, 5 minutes of yoga, 5 minutes of breathing, whatever it is that you're doing. And then once a week to add another thing. So whatever it is that you've been doing, once per week, do a different one. And the idea is to just make it a habit to spend a little bit of time in your day, truly no more than 10 minutes, focused on yourself and your well-being. Again, it's not a fix to all of the stressors that our TCs have, but it is an important habit for people to get into, to prioritize their well-being a little bit. And of course, the hope is that some of those things will become self-sustaining because it feels good to do that stuff. And so ultimately, we don't want them to do it because, Denise told them to do it. We want them to do it because it feels good and because it's supportive to the other work that they're trying to do. Every month, we also have a monthly challenge, and that tends to be something a little bit different. Some of these things I've taken from Parker Palmer's work. His book, The Courage to Teach, is quite well known, but there are many other resources he has connected to holistic well-being. So those monthly challenges might be to write a letter thanking a teacher from your past who made an impact on you, and perhaps you never got an opportunity to tell them, and update them on where you're at. Many of us as educators, whether we're in the K-12 system or post-secondary or other kinds of educators, we form these strong connections with our students, and we don't get to know how their lives play out. And so why is that a well-being thing? Because there's research that says when you reach out to somebody and you say thank you for something, that boosts their well-being, and it also boosts your own well-being. So we're just trying to create in these subtle ways, a culture of connectedness and wellness. My personal belief is that so much of well-being really is about relationships. That can be a relationship with self, with the natural world, and with others. Um, and this is the other piece for teachers. Teachers tend to have, ironically, sort of a lonely job in some ways. A lot of teachers spend, most of their day with their students, of course, but there's research that talks about how teachers often feel like there's no one in the building that they feel like they can actually share their struggles with. That, you work as a team, but you work as a team in your individual classrooms and don't have a lot of opportunities for connection. So some of the work I've been doing with schools is actually just getting teachers to do some well-being programming that doesn't look like well-being programming. It's, sit in a circle and share with each other the meaning of your name or one of your, names that people might not even know you go by outside of the school context. Getting to know each other is creating opportunities for meaningful connection. I think those things boost our well-being. Again, it's hard to measure, but it makes an impact.
Yeah, you know what that makes me think of is when I was a teacher candidate, I remember my instructors saying, don't be afraid to reach out for help. Don't be afraid to build community. And that's all well and good. But when you're a junior member at a school, you don't always feel comfortable just reaching out for help, especially when it's for perhaps help with a student or there's some sort of minor crisis in your room. I really didn't feel comfortable. So for my first 2 years of teaching, I remember feeling very lonely. And then in my third year, I went to a school where they had this established thing where every Thursday after school, the staff would go out for a drink or a coffee every Thursday. And some number of staff did it every week. I went every week. And I'm telling you, everything changed. I see now in retrospect, that was wellness. At the time, it was just socializing. But suddenly I felt comfortable to go into my new friends' classroom at recess and ask for their advice or for their help. And it was really a profound change. So
community really matters in terms of well-being. I think community really goes a long way. And so the corporate version of wellness is like run a 10K and eat some spinach. And of course, those can be awesome for well-being if that feels good. But real, a holistic view of wellness is about building these community supports. I was really brought to this work in addition to the Teachers of Tomorrow program through my rabbinic work. So, in tandem to my teacher education, I work as a rabbi. And I was part of a program called Rabbis Without Borders. And we did all kinds of interesting learning, a lot of it rooted in positive psychology. And I remember learning about the loneliness epidemic and just feeling gutted at the research on how lonely young people are. When people coined the term the loneliness epidemic, they coined it for senior communities, which of course it remains a large problem that people who are seniors are often lonely and disconnected. But people didn't realize that young folks who go to school, who are surrounded by peers all day, who often are connected on social media, who do go to parties or other things, on the surface, it doesn't look like they're lonely, but they are. They're the loneliest group of people, statistically. And so what does it mean to be surrounded by people and feel alone? And that's why I talk about how schools have this opportunity to do this differently, because they are first and foremost gathering places. Of course, I care about academics. I want people to learn how to, write essays and do equations and whatever else they're doing. But I want people when they go to school to feel like they're part of a team. And that is well-being programming too.
Yeah, I love that. And so, on that note, then, so if we're talking to pre service teachers and we're talking about the importance of community and reaching out to their colleagues and creating time in their day to make connections with their students, what advice would you give to a school leader to help to cultivate that kind of environment, especially if they're perhaps entering a school where that hasn't been the culture in the past and siloing is prominent?
Well, I think the good news is we do have curricular connections for this. So some of the work I've done, and it's also where my kids have attended school, is a school that focuses on a holistic curriculum. So examples of things that they do that I think all schools could be doing is they have sharing circles regularly. So people just talk about what they did on the weekend, but sometimes kids will reveal things they're struggling with, and it just provides that kind of in the moment opportunity for support. They'll go out into the forest. Everybody has to make a connection with a certain tree. This is just in the park close to the school, a 5-minute walk away. And then they kind of make art about their tree and maybe write a poem about their tree and talk about their tree with each other. But so like building those connections with the land and also with one another through that also provides the opportunity for on the walk on the way there. When I did it with the teachers, I said, walk with somebody you don't know very well and get to know them. Sometimes it's just that little prompt that makes a difference. They have all kinds of beautiful programming around solstice. One of the things I love that the school does that I think all schools could do is when students enter the school, either in kindergarten or whenever they join the school community, if they transfer to the school in grade 3 or anytime, they're given an acorn. In what they have an acorn ceremony, and then when they graduate, they get a sapling. And it's just such beautiful. I know, right? And I know it makes me tear. And when you get your acorn, it's a way of saying you're part of our community. I get all like anyway. I care about this stuff so much. These are not things that take so much time, but they're things that often teachers don't feel like they have time to do. So a lot of this is about leadership. Lauren, you asked about what if a teacher joins the community. I think in our individual classrooms, we can do these things, but also if we get into a position of leadership, we can encourage the whole team to do this kind of work. When it becomes a school-wide activity, that is quite meaningful. And at Trent, in our School of Education Wellbeing program, this is part of the goal too. Our students are really often stressed out. They're juggling so many things. They have a heavy class load. We know we expect a lot of our students, and many of them are working, and many of them have caregiving responsibilities. And so they're managing a lot. And I think it matters to say, we're going to spend an hour knitting together and chatting again. Like, this is worth making the time for. And, that's been a challenge with the wellbeing program. People often say, I don't have time for well-being, and exactly, we have to make this a priority. We have to shift the culture of teaching. I'm going to say one more thing about it. I remember being in a meeting several years ago with some of our board partners, union representatives, and they were talking about how, teachers now, they want all this extra time to be able to go to the gym or meet up with friends. And I remember when I was a beginning teacher, I used to work, morning until night. I never had a spare minute. I would say family, I'll talk to you in the winter break. And I was like, that's not good. Let's not, that's not what we want for these teachers. And just because you lived through, that kind of expectation doesn't mean we should be doing that now. I think there's been a culture of overwork within and outside of teaching. And I think we have to change it and say, we do need to model well-being, and we can't do that if we don't give ourselves opportunity to make the time for the things that matter.
Yes. And practically speaking, we're also at a moment and a place in the world where we need teachers, but we're struggling with teacher retention. So just even from a quantitative money, facts and figures perspective, it is to our benefit to create an environment that is, sustainable for the teachers that have passion in that area. And just thinking still about the Trent Wellness Program, one final question there would be just for any broad macro reflections you have on the program at this time. So for example, have you identified any key point successes or challenges or potential next steps, next directions for the program?
Yeah, so many. So as I mentioned early on, it became an opportunity for connection and well-being work in the context of the lockdown. So people were really hungry for connection. And whenever we would run a session, it was really well attended. When the COVID-19 lockdowns were lifted and people came back to campus, the well-being program was really, really popular. People wanted to come. So I'm realizing I didn't fully flesh out what the program looks like. In addition to the learning management system with those challenges, we also run workshops. So this is an incredibly important part of the program where different faculty members and sometimes community members will run workshops, and they range from learning about the medicine wheel from Indigenous contexts, nature walks, yoga, mindfulness meditation, learning how to, I run one called Are You Managing Your Tech, or is your tech managing you? So we run all of these workshops, and students have to take 3 of them. So after the COVID lockdowns, people were really interested and came to these workshops in droves. And then we saw a shift. Folks were tapped out, and we were running these workshops that were very poorly attended. And then at the same time as that, the Ministry of Education in Ontario created new requirements for teachers to lead wellbeing programming. And schools of education need to provide some modeling or instruction around that, the way we do around everything else we expect teachers to do. So we decided to make the wellbeing program a mandatory aspect. And there was a lot of pushback. I'll be honest, a lot of this, I don't have time for this. You can't make me sit in classes this long and then expect me to come to an extra thing. These are only 3 one-hour workshops over the course of the entire academic year, but still people really resisted. And so part of this is about how do we cultivate buy-in? I think whenever there's a new change, it's hard. People knew it hadn't been mandatory before. Now that it's been mandatory for a while, I think people sort of accept it. And the other pitch we're making is, you do need to lead these kinds of programs as a teacher. So how are you going to know how to do it? And the other aspect is, as you mentioned, teacher retention. In 2018, the organization EdCan did a huge project about teacher well-being, and found that after about 8 years in the profession, a lot of teachers burn out and leave. And so exactly as you say, if we don't figure out how to be well, then we can't have career longevity, which is a problem for our schools, of course, but it's also a problem for us. You've invested so much in becoming a teacher. Don't you want it to be sustainable? Don't you want to be able to do this throughout your career? So well-being really is essential. So I'd be remiss if I didn't say this year I'm not running the program because I'm on sabbatical. So we have the wonderful Lisa Noble and Rachel Nichols from the School of Education who have taken it on and are continuing to deepen it, running amazing workshops, more workshops. And I'm excited to see, now that we're more of a distance away from the lockdowns, what the program will sort of settle into, because there's been all of these sort of, necessary changes as the world has shifted. Hopefully now we'll settle, and it's a mandatory program. That's part of our offerings. I'd love to see it become a course that students take as part of their required courses, as opposed to a sort of add-on. But I think the program we do is really solid, both in terms of its content and, as we spoke about, its opportunity for community building.
If I could shift gears just a tiny bit here, you mentioned at the beginning the importance of spiritual well-being, right? And I think when we talk about wellness in schools, I don't think we're doing an awesome job at it, if I'm being honest, right? But I think when we think one of the obvious places we might go is physical wellness. We have daily physical activity hypothetically built into our day. We talk about nutrition. These are built explicitly into the curriculum, right? Even emotional, that's becoming, I think, more talked about in schools. Of course, we're on a journey with that. But something that I think is that people perhaps are nervous or afraid to talk about, especially in like public schools, would be the spiritual dimension of wellness. It might be something that, we don't do that here. We don't want to make anyone feel whatever kind of way. And I think there might be this misinterpretation of what it means to be spiritually well or to serve our spiritual selves. And that really jumped out at me when you started talking about the nature walk and the acorn and the tree. I felt what you were saying on a spiritual level. And that's my relationship with nature. When I go into nature, that's when I feel most in touch with my spiritual self. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that.
I could talk about that for 500 years. I'll try and use the thing. So, as I mentioned, I'm a rabbi. I care about spiritual well-being. And, I always had these two parts of my career as a rabbi and a teacher educator. And more, I was like, these are the same thing in a way. That what people need right now, and actually the literal meaning of the word rabbi comes from the root rav, which means teacher. We need teachers. We need leaders. We need to follow them. We need to be them. And people do have spiritual needs. And of course, schools need to be careful about proselytizing or about, of course, as a religious minority, I worry about a kind of spirituality that draws too heavily from a majority religion. But that's not what I'm talking about when I talk about spirituality in schools. So I'll give some, if people are interested in this, first of all, I have an article coming out in a journal. The whole journal is on this topic called Holistic Education Review. And my piece is called Secular Spirituality in Schools, because I want it to be secular. I want it to be for people of all faith and no faith. But we do have spiritual dimensions. Our Indigenous leaders know about this. Part of the medicine wheel is the spiritual element. So it is different for everybody, but it is things like connecting with awe, AWE. That is often what we feel when we go into nature. And that's also all of your positive psychology. Feelings of awe boost well-being, and they serve our spiritual selves. Connecting, as I said, with meaning and purpose can be a spiritual pursuit. Folks probably know Robin Wall Kimmerer for work braiding sweetgrass and others. And I attended a talk by her, and someone asked, so as a teacher, I'm trying to get at what you're writing about. But like so much of my day is spent marking and assessing, what do I do it? And Kimmerer said, look, I think the purpose of education is to help people figure out what their contribution is to make and help them have the skills to be able to make it. Assess for that, and that's spiritual in my view. We are here to do something, to serve, to contribute, and whatever skills and talents we have, I think has to be the service of something larger. So that's spiritual. The work of Parker Palmer, as I mentioned, and I draw on the work of John Miller from Boise, who has been a pioneer in this area. His book, The Holistic Curriculum, talks about schools as sanctuaries. So it's on purpose a bit of a religious word, right? That a school, what if we thought of schools as sanctuary spaces where everyone is welcome and where all of our, multifaceted human needs get met? So that's the thing about creating a connection with the tree and a sit spot and connecting with solstice and sharing circles. Those are spiritual pursuits. I do want teachers to be noticing and concerned about cultural appropriation. This is a fine line we walk. I actually think it's good when schools do mindfulness meditation and yoga, but those do come from spiritual traditions that most of the teachers teaching these things aren't part of. So let's, give credit where credit's due and not overstep in terms of, taking on a spirituality that isn't your own. And I think that there are ways that we can incorporate these things into schools and have those conversations and be really mindful. And serving those spiritual needs will go a long way in terms of what schools are up against, which is bullying and loneliness, as I mentioned, and a lack of academic performance. People who are struggling aren't learning, right? And so, very often I think there's this false dichotomy between the academics and the spiritual wellness work, but they're the same. You can't have one without the other. So, so I do think the spiritual element is often overlooked, and I agree that schools could be doing that better. There are resources to do this in a secular way.
This reminds me a little bit of, I saw a lecture in the summer given by David Meggs, who's a Canadian academic and scholar, and just paraphrasing one of the things he was saying, and he's talking about Western cultural history here, just for context, but he was talking about how 500 years ago and before in the Western world, there was a lot of meaning and symbolism in life, in day-to-day life, but there wasn't a lot of knowledge. People were not necessarily aware that washing your hands was helpful to prevent illness, for example. So we were heavy on meaning and symbolism and light on knowledge. And now it has totally shifted in the Western world again, that we are very light on meaning and symbolism and being, and heavy on knowledge, but that isn't holistic. Now, one of his solutions is arts-based practice as a pathway towards meaning and towards being. However, we know that there are other practices in a holistic way that can lead to similar outcomes. And also, I do want to recognize that he was talking from a Western perspective, and there are cultures, such as Indigenous cultures, who have not lost the spiritual, the meaning, the symbolism that perhaps the Western world has lost. So I hope and I foresee in an optimistic way that the next century and the next generation might be a return in a modern way to what you're talking about in the pursuit of a more holistic wellness. And I'm happy that Trent University can be perhaps a leader in that process, with folks such as yourself at the helm.
Oh, it's exciting work. I find all of this stuff so fascinating. So there's a gender component to for sure to this, knowledge over emotion or the body. And the body is interesting. This is the thing about holistic well-being. I think even in the wellness space, it often gets divided. You do certain things for your body and you do certain things for your brain, and never the twain shall meet, right? But the best of it is when they are connected. Another piece people might be interested in that really influenced is something. It's a piece called "How We Gather" by Angie Thurston and Casper ter Kuile from the Harvard Divinity School, and they created something called the Sacred Design Lab. So it really is about bringing in spirituality in all kinds of ways. But "How We Gather" is largely about what has replaced the church in the lives of typical, it's a US study, so Americans, but this certainly applies to Canadians and others. So they're looking at places like SoulCycle and CrossFit, so fitness places that even the word soul cycle, in school we're afraid to use the word soul, but fitness places use it all the time. I am working on a paper, no one steal this, on the class. You might see ads for the class. And this is a church. This is meant to bring together your spiritual and your physical self in the service of physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual health. There's no question. That is the objective. But they're corporate, these are large money-making places. And I think that one of the mistakes schools make is that we have DPA, we have daily physical activity, and then we sort of get on with the business. But, how do we integrate the body? How do we integrate the soul or the spirit? I know those are scary words for teachers, but if you just think about yourself, whoever you are and however you are, what needs are we repressing through the day? And how can we actually do this holistically? Like I said, go for a walk, encourage people to talk to each other. Then when you get there, spend a moment of quiet by a tree. It doesn't have to be hard. It certainly doesn't have to be expensive. But if you think of how much money people will pay for some of these organizations to get that experience that is somatic in the body, that is also spiritual, that is, holistic, where you build a community and people will notice if you show up or don't show up. Our schools could be doing that, without people paying thousands of dollars.
It makes me think of, I can't remember where I heard this, but it was maybe on a podcast, Zachary Stein talking about like the transactional nature of education and knowledge as currency. And what that perpetuates is this mindset of what can I get, right? Students come to school every day and they think, what can I get? What will I get on this? If I do this, what do I get in return? And if we shifted away from that and we decentered grades and to refocus on something else and such that we were perpetuating or supporting a mindset of what can I give, right? And so coming to school and it links back to what you were saying earlier about recognizing what Robin Wall Kimmerer was saying about recognizing who you are and what you can give, and then as educators, our job becoming supporting those students and developing those skills so that they can truly contribute to society or making the world a better place. So that giving mentality is perhaps, I think, very much connected to that community building approach that we're so desperately trying to motivate in our educators.
Yes. And I know some people get nervous because they're like, well, but what about the economy? What about, so I have to say, look, I was a student in the 80s and 90s. There is no way my teachers could have prepared me for the work environment that currently exists. No one had email. The internet didn't exist, or certainly not for everyday people. We cannot possibly anticipate the economic needs that our society will have when our students are in the workforce. We can't know. Even just the way AI has changed the game in the last couple of years, we cannot know. All we can do is help people become their best selves, which is a spiritual as well as an economic pursuit, right? I'm not against students making money in their lives. I would like for them to do it in a way that is of service and ethical, have them have these considerations. But, when we talk about, grading, students will often say like, well, is this going to be on the test or am I going to need this? So everything we do, you're going to need. This poem, yes, you need to be someone who's experienced poetry, Yes, this science class, like you might not become a scientist, but you have to have a curiosity about how the world works. You have to become an interesting person. And more, the good news is, the more well-rounded and curious and innovative you are, actually, the better you'll do economically. We are not in the business of job training. I don't think educators ever were, but we certainly can't be now because we don't know what the jobs will be. We were in the business of creating amazing citizens. And I did want to mention, just from a theory perspective, a lot of educators, whether they know it or not, draw on the work of John Dewey, who wrote about democratic education. We're in a time where citizenship education is crucial. I mean, with the amount of misinformation, the impact on our political system, which, all of these things also make us profoundly unwell in all kinds of ways. But John Dewey talked about something called a common faith, where he was sort of talking about spirituality in schools and how we have to figure out a way to create whole people and nurture our whole selves. So that was work being done, decades and decades ago, and we're just starting to really figure it out.
Although this feels like a great place to wrap up because I'm so fired up and inspired. And also looking at time, I would feel remiss if I didn't bring it back just to conclude to any just on the ground practical tips. You've been sprinkling them through this whole conversation, certainly, but just to finish with any usable practical tips for those educators that are feeling burnout, either for themselves to nurture their own healing or for their classes to incorporate wellness practices into their classrooms, be they small tips, small pieces of advice, or on a larger scale.
Yeah. Well, first of all, if any educators are listening and you're feeling stressed out and overwhelmed, you're certainly not alone. We are up against so much. It's hard right now with our schools. So sometimes it's just about acknowledging, I think teachers tend to be really positive and like, okay, no problem. I can handle this challenge. And eventually we're like, too many challenges. So just letting it be known that we're dealing with a lot and it's okay if it feels like a lot. I do think that people need to carve out 10 minutes. I really think it's 10 minutes. A little goes a long way to do something that feels nurturing and supportive. Avoid the diet culture trappings. This is not about looking a certain way. This is about like focusing inward and recognizing that you deserve rest, you deserve care. What feels nurturing to you might be different from the next person. So is it journaling? Is it joining a writing class or an art class? Is it taking a nature walk? Is it yoga? Any of these things, all of these things. But starting with 10 minutes, I think feels doable for people who are like, I don't have any time. Set your alarm 10 minutes earlier or go to bed 10 minutes later. And I'm saying this as somebody who juggles multiple jobs, has young kids. I understand that it can feel like there are no minutes in the day. So find the 10 minutes. It will go a long way. And then similarly in your classrooms, I think teachers are already doing a lot of this, but recognize that and maybe get intentional about it. Can you create 10 minutes or 15 minutes where you can do like a little go around where people share about their lives? Can you take your students outside for that class, even if it's cold, play in the snow, or have a leaf fight, depending on the season you're in, get to know a tree, do activities where students journal, and then at the same time, instead of catching up on grading, journal too, make art together, laugh together, find opportunities for lots of play. All of these are well-being pursuits that we can bring together.
When I was 18, I was a waitress at the Olive Garden, and I was having a very stressful moment. I had too many tables, and I was almost on the verge of tears. And I remember a more experienced server said to me, "See that table over there?" And he was pointing at a large group. He said, "They might just have to wait 10 minutes for their drinks, and that's okay." And I have always remembered that. It's been such a good metaphor for me in my life, that also recognizing that you cannot be there every moment right away for everyone all the time. And if you need 10 minutes, like you said, for yourself, that is okay. And if that means that somebody, be it in your class or on your staff, has to wait for a couple minutes, that's okay. That's part of their journey, you know?
We all, I think, have to become better at waiting. We live in a very fast-paced world. This has been my work too, trying to be all things to all people, being really, really overscheduled and overburdened. And at a certain point, I just do things less well. I don't want to be a mom who yells at my kids, and I don't want to be a teacher that rushes through my encounters with students because I have to get to the next thing. And this is actually a lesson that I've learned mostly from our Indigenous students. We had an Indigenous student, I won't name him in case he wouldn't like that. He was my student in the Bachelor of Education and then the Master's of Education program. And he would come to my office, not during scheduled office hours. He would just come and he would just sit and he would start to chin it. And I was always a little bit like, oh, okay, but I have to, there's a meeting or I'm working on a paper or whatever. And he would say, Denise, part of teaching is visiting.
Oh, that's so nice.
He's right. He's right.
Well, I just have to say how much I've enjoyed this conversation and how badly I wish it could continue. So we'll probably have to do this again. Yeah.
Anytime. It's a pleasure to talk to you both. And it's one of the things about well-being is often we do work with amazing people, and it's so great for me to know. Part of what makes me feel like I can take a rest is knowing you're out there doing this awesome work. So we can't all do it all the time, but together we can accomplish a lot.
Well, thank you for all that you do, Denise. We would like to acknowledge that this episode was recorded on Mississauga, Mississauga territory, treaty and traditional, at Trent University in Peterborough, Nogojoanong, Ontario, Canada. We are grateful to the First Nations of this territory for their teachings about and care for the land on which we teach and learn. The podcast was made possible by a Trent University Knowledge Mobilization Grant and is skillfully edited and produced by our friend James Bailey.